Video 2 will continue our discussion by looking at a few other ways that learning changes across contexts. To start, we want to look at the opposite of generalization, which is something called discrimination. Discrimination is the tendency that we have for behavior to occur in one very specific situation and not another. We know, generally speaking, that the less similar a situation is to what that situation looked like during training, the less likely behavioral transfer is to happen, or generalization. Again, discrimination and generalization are opposites. A good example I have for you of this, I want you to think back to when you were a kid, if you can. Remember babysitting. Did you behave the same way for your parents as you behaved for your babysitter? I know I did not. A lot of the time you have kids who may be very well behaved for their parents or for an adult, but when the teenage babysitter comes over, those behaviors all go out the window. This is actually discrimination. Those behaviors we learn to exhibit for adults don't generalize to teenagers. So when there's a babysitter or a teenage babysitter in the picture, you see discrimination occurring. This can actually happen in a couple different ways. We can use conditioning to establish discrimination, intentionally causing this type of lack of generalization to occur, using classical and operant conditioning. With classical conditioning discrimination training, you do something like this. You pair one stimuli with a neutral stimulus, but not the other. So, for example, if you were trying to train a kid to be happy or feel good when they see a specific stuffed animal, you might pair a happy face with it over and over again. However, you don't want that same association to form with other stuffed animals, so you repeatedly place another stuffed animal in the environment without pairing it with that smiley face. Over time, the child will learn to associate happiness with a specific stuffed animal and not another. It's a very silly explanation. I don't know why you would ever do that. There might be a reason, but you can see how this could be useful in other contexts. For example, you might want to train your dog to behave a certain way around you and not another person. Maybe you want your dog to be very scary and mean and a good guard dog, but you don't want them to behave that way at home. So you teach them to fear other people, but not fear the people in your own household. We can also use operant conditioning discrimination training. And with this, each stimuli has a different consequence. Just like associations with classical conditioning, we're training the learner to associate positive or negative things with the object here. So for one example, if you want your kid to play more with a specific toy, you might repeatedly pair it with a lollipop. But you don't want them to play with that other stuffed animal, so you repeatedly pair that with timeout. That teaches discrimination. And that leads us to something very important called stimulus control. Stimulus control is what happens when any given behavior is under the influence of a discriminant stimuli, meaning that the way you behave, the way you respond to stimuli in your environment are dependent on the other stimuli present. That might sound a little confusing. Think about this example. While you're driving, you're actually under stimulus control. One example of stimulus that controls your behavior while driving is traffic lights. There's others. Cops, for example, might make you slam on your brakes. Don't do that, it's dangerous. But traffic lights control our behavior when we're driving because the color that we see it automatically produces a learned behavior in us. You've been trained to drive when it's green and stop when it's red, and hopefully slow down and not speed up when it's yellow. That's an example of stimulus control. The stimuli in your environment are dictating what specific behaviors you're illustrating in that moment. Another example, you behave one way at a college party. You very likely do not behave that way when you're at a work event or at a family gathering. The college party, work event, family gathering are all stimuli that actually elicit control on your behavior, whether or not you're aware of it. And this all happens through conditioning. We learn to behave these ways based off of how that behavior was reinforced or punished, or what we associated with it in the past. Another interesting example of how we can use these principles to teach us about other behaviors is something called mental rotation. I want you to consider this problem for a second. Is this letter, or are these two letters, backwards? Look at each of them and tell me if they're backwards or not. Then I want you to think about how you came to that conclusion. This problem is actually under stimulus control. Your response to it was controlled based off of stimuli. Interestingly enough, most people solve this problem by looking at that letter and then imagining what that letter should look like, what it normally looks like, how we're used to seeing it. That sense of what we're used to is controlling our answer to this question, or controlling how we interpret the problem. Just like with your speed, your braking, controlled by traffic lights. The answer to this question is that we rotate the image mentally. So you take the B and you rotate it to the left. Sorry, I'm not good with geography. You take the A and you rotate it in your mind to the right. But that's all based off of stimuli control. Another example is something called concept formation. A concept in this context is a group of things that share a similar feature, such as butterflies. These features actually allow us to use discrimination to decide or determine whether something belongs to a group as an in-group member or doesn't belong to the group. We use our concept of what a butterfly is to discriminate or to generalize, to say that is not a butterfly, discrimination, or that is a butterfly, generalization. You can also train animals to do this, actually. One study gave pigeons treats when they pecked pictures of humans. They've reinforced that behavior. And over time, after they learned that, when they were given a picture of a non-human or a human, they would peck the human. They formed a concept of human, generalized all of the features, and discriminated features that aren't associated with humans, and were able to learn, basically, without realizing it, what a human is and what a human is not. The last example I want to give you is going to look back at smoking relapse. We've talked a little bit about smoking cessation in the past, but I want to look at how stimulus control impacts our understanding of how hard it is and what we can do to help people quit. So we learned a long time ago that when we're in a situation that we've associated with smoking in the past, this can actually produce relapse. I think the example that I gave was, say you used to always smoke in your garage. Anytime you go into the garage, it's harder to not smoke. The reason that happens is because of stimulus control. You have discriminative stimuli here, okay? Being in that garage or being around another person smoking or someone you used to be around or to smoke with prompts people to smoke themselves. That's the discriminative stimuli. We have two options here where we can use these principles to not only understand why relapse happens, but to help us kind of control that situation. One option, avoid any stimulus that prompts smoking. Any situation where you feel stimulus control happens to you and prompts you to smoke, avoid that. Unfortunately, it's not always that simple. A lot of people can't avoid the locations or the people or the other stimuli that prompt that behavior. So we use stimulus training. Think back to what we learned earlier in the videos. We can teach people to discriminate here, to no longer associate that situation with smoking, and that can subsequently help them stop or avoid relapse. This is very similar to systematic desensitization, which we've talked about in the past. And what we do here, we expose a person to a stimuli without letting them smoke. That's all it is. When that happens, you break down that generalization. You teach them this setting no longer has control over that behavior, and it allows them to quit or to not relapse.